you open a Bible and just bookmark it to Hebrews chapter 10, please? Hebrews chapter 10. It'll take us a few minutes to get there. So you can just bookmark it and kind of hold it, set it aside for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to it in a minute. You know how the Old Testament commanded that the Jews offer sacrifices to God in the tabernacle and in the temple? And you know how they did that every day, morning and evening, for centuries on end, right? And you know that that was the way that they worshiped God, and they appealed to God for forgiveness of sins, and He paid attention to that for centuries, accepting His people's worship day in, day out, including and additionally the feast days and all that sort of thing for centuries on end. But you know that the temple was eventually destroyed, right? That around 70 years after Jesus was born, the Roman army marched in and besieged the city of Jerusalem from April to August. And in August, they breached the city. They set a fire that eventually spread to the temple and burned it to the ground, the entire temple complex. And so here's the thought that I had this past week as I was reading the book of Hebrews and the whole thing about sacrifices, and just kind of thinking about that in context of history. Here's what occurred to me. There was a day when the very last sacrifice was offered in the temple. There was one sacrifice that was offered in the temple that was the very last one for all of time. And I don't know why, but that realization had never really occurred to me. Of course, it's obvious once you realize it, but I had just never really thought about it. And then in thinking about that, here's the question that came to my mind. Did the priests who were offering that particular sacrifice know that it would be the very last one? Did anybody standing there know that after almost 1,500 years of twice daily sacrifices in that place, plus all the festival and feast sacrifices, plus all the individual offerings made by people like you and me that would come in seeking God's forgiveness of our sins, after all of that, this was the very last one? Sometimes I find myself thinking about the endings of things. And this has been happening to me a lot. And I don't know if it's because of the ending of the school year or if it's just because I'm hitting a certain age where you start thinking like that. If that's what it is, don't tell me, okay? Those of you who are older and more experienced and wiser, don't tell me. But I've been thinking about the endings of things. So like right now, I've been thinking about the ending of the school year that has just ended for a lot of you. It's about to end this week for some more of you. Teachers and students and administrators, this is an ending point where you kind of mark something is finished and something else will start in a few months. But I've also been thinking about the teachers and the administrators that are retiring this year. That like when this school year ends, this is it. And there are always some. So that for somebody somewhere, probably somebody that you know, they won't be going back to school again this fall. It's the same for graduation. Granted, somebody's graduating high school and they know their plans to go to college, but somebody's graduating college and that's it. You're done. It's an end point. And all those lasts, they have an emotional significance, I think, in that kind of setting. I've also been thinking about all the products that have been discontinued from when I was a kid. Like, I know that I'm a certain age now because Facebook's been suggesting all these videos going, if you remember this, you're starting to get old. Well, guess what? I am. But I've just been thinking about that. Like, it's weird to think that those items or like shows that I watched as a kid or snacks that my mom bought for me, like, they don't make that anymore. There was a last one. There's a full end for that now. I think about people that their careers are coming to an end after a long tenure. I have a friend here in town who's been a cake baker for 40 years and he's retiring this year. And like, there will be a last wedding cake that will mark the end of that career for him. I have a family member that's getting ready to retire from his business after 50 years in that business. And there will be a last day of work for him. And then my grandpa, I think about him, he retired after preaching for well over 60 years. 60 years of being in the pulpit nearly every Sunday. And then there was a last sermon. And you know that's the end of it. I think about buildings that have stood for a very, very long time, and yet eventually everything that humans build, it crumbles, doesn't it? I mean, even the pyramids have lost something since they were constructed. Everything we build, it crumbles over time. It comes to an end. And then I think about churches that have closed their doors. The first congregation where I was fully employed as their minister, they've since closed their doors. And nobody's meeting in that place anymore. That group is not going to meet as that group in that place anymore. And I just think about those endings, and I wonder how many times people did or did not know this is the end. Right here, this is the last one of these that will be made. This is the last time I will do this. This is the last meeting of this group. How did it feel to be there for the very last thing? How did it feel to walk away that day and close the doors and lock them for the last time? And do you think that the priests who offered that last day's batch of sacrifices felt that impact? My hunch is they probably didn't, because they didn't know the Romans would break through the next day. But if they had seen it coming, how would it have felt to watch the fires burn low for that final time as this institution that is 1,500 years old is coming to its final end? Now, once we have thoroughly attached ourselves to that emotional moment, let's consider what it means that those sacrifices came to an end after such a long history. Was the finality of the sacrificial system really this awful, total, terrible event? Mostly, no. Isn't that kind of surprising? To think about kind of the emotionally crushing weight of this being the last thing, but in the grand scheme of reality, it's actually not that bad of a thing. It probably felt that way to those priests if that's what they knew it to be, but it was a moment where they were realizing and being taught a hard but necessary truth from God. And that truth was that the sacrificial system was no longer needed because God had something infinitely better that He had already given to His people. And that's what gets us to Hebrews chapter 10. Start reading with me in Hebrews 10, the first 4 verses. The old system under the law of Moses was only a shadow, a preview of good things to come, not the good things themselves. The sacrifices under that system were repeated again and again, year after year, but they were never able to provide perfect forgiveness for those who came to worship. If they could have provided perfect cleansing, the sacrifices would have stopped, for the worshipers would have been purified once for all time, and their feelings of guilt would have disappeared. But instead, those sacrifices actually reminded them of their sins year after year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Now scan down and keep reading in verse 11. Under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day after day, offering the same sacrifices again and again, which can never take away sins. But our high priest offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. Then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. There he waits until his enemies are humbled and made a footstool under his feet. For by that one offering, he forever made perfect those who are being made holy. You see, the priests who were working that last day of the temple, they were working long after Jesus' death and resurrection. And I don't know if they knew that, number one, their sacrifices and that whole system were supposed to come to an end. And number two, I don't know if they knew that God had already perfected the entire system and made it obsolete. The Christians, though, I don't know about the priests, but I do know that the Christians everywhere who had been persecuted, who had been run out of Jerusalem, scattered all over the known world, they knew. They knew that it was done and that it was supposed to be done. They knew that when God brought it to an end, that was right. And so when that final sacrifice was offered the day before the temple was burned, they knew that the ending of that system was already overdue because they knew Jesus. They knew the sacrifice for all time, the one who perfected everything and made it possible for all people to be forgiven for all time. They knew that God had already given them the mercy of a sacrifice to end all sacrifices. He had already brought about the finality of the whole thing. And so the final sacrifice in the temple was the last one. But it wasn't really necessary anyway. Because the final sacrifice that was necessary had already been made. In the death of Jesus Christ on a cross, from which He rose from the dead 3 days later. And so let's eat and drink from His body and His blood. And let's be truly grateful to God for the perfect sacrifice to end all sacrifices, for the gift of His Son, Jesus Christ.